All right, I'm using a program called IA Presenter. It's in beta. I like it. The one thing is I don't have a lot of control on the layout of my slides. So if something looks a little off, I'm sorry. I would love to hear from you and get feedback from you about well, first of all, if you liked the presentation, if you learned anything from it, and then also I would be interested about the slides in particular. Be good feedback. And then the last thing I want to do before I begin, I want to do a land acknowledgement. In North America, we are all on land that was taken away from indigenous populations. And I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape people. Okay, so what is OOUX? It's object-oriented UX. And what is ORCA? It stands for objects, relationships, calls to action, and attributes. So we're gonna get into all of that, but first I want to talk about information architecture. So to my mind, today's theme, orientation and wayfinding, I feel like these are maybe the top two things that a good IA accomplishes. In our physical spaces and in our digital products, we want users to know exactly where they are. We want them to know exactly what they're looking at. We want them to be able to find things that they need easily. And we want them to know how to get to the next place or find the thing that they're looking for. And I think that in a solid information architecture, we'll have those things, those principles baked in. So I first learned about the term OOUX when I read Sophia Prater's first article in A List Apart. It was like 2015. And at that time, I'm a total newbie. I'm self-taught. I'm a career changer. I wasn't even in my first official UX job yet. So parts of that article, it didn't make sense to me. But the parts that did make sense to me were things that, I already believed in, and I was looking for more of that. So like, how do we design holistically? How do you think about your thing as a system? And also what I really liked is that the way that she shaped her article was like a lesson in applied information architecture, which being self-taught, that was really hard to find anything. A lot of information architecture articles and books and talks, they're just like really high level academic stuff, and it's hard to grasp. So this was a little bit easier, although it still had a hard time grasping it. So flash forward a few years, about 6 years, I kept thinking about that article. I kept going back to it, and then I found her certification course, and I became a certified OOUX strategist. And now I cannot stop talking about OOUX, and I use it all the time. And I think here's why. In my experience, I don't think teams are giving enough time and attention to information architecture. I'm not completely certain why that is, but I think that as our products have become more and more complex, the IA is that much harder. And I think that either people are skipping it because it's really hard and they don't know how to do it. But also I think some teams are skipping it because they don't know that they're skipping it. They're defining information architecture simply as navigation. And I don't agree with that definition. I think information architecture is the structure of your system. It's the rules and the logic and how your system works and looks. And your primary navigation is a part of it for sure, but it's not the whole of it. So a lot of the projects that I come into are in varying degrees of messy. Things are very often not defined properly. Two things that are completely different might have the same label, or two different labels might be applied to the exact same thing. Also, things are very often not connected properly. I see so many dead ends in task flows. So if we can design a solid foundation for our product, we can avoid a lot of mistakes like that. So today I'm going to talk to you about how OOUX and ORCA can help you design strong information architectures that inherently have good orientation and wayfinding. Okay, so what is OOUX? It's an idea, it's a concept, it's a philosophy for designing digital systems that respects the fact that people think in objects. And I'm calling it a fact. I'm not going to get into it here, but there have been numerous studies by linguists and psychologists that come to the same conclusion, that most humans around the globe think in a nouns first way. So even if a community's native language is more verb focused, the children in those communities are still thinking in a nouns first way. And so because we think in a nouns first way, we understand the world better when we have consistent, recognizable objects in our environment or our product. So again, OOUX is a philosophy, it's an idea that respects the fact that people think in objects. So what is ORCA? ORCA is a tool. It was created by Sophia Prater. I have a slide at the end of this that has a whole list of resources, so feel free to screen capture that when we get to it. ORCA is a process. It helps translate research into clarified design structure. So we say it sits in the nook between the two traditional diamonds. The process is not at all prescriptive. I think a lot of people who've heard about it have that misconception. It's not at all prescriptive. It's very flexible. People in the OOUX community are adapting it to fit their own work. So like they're adjusting it to do it in an enterprise setting, or they're adjusting it to work alongside a service design project. I think the process of ORCA really guides you to think holistically about the thing that you're designing. It's holistic, but also we ask a lot of questions and we get really granular. So it's the zoom out view and the really tight zoom in view. So even though I said it's not completely rigid, there is one requirement. Sorry, I've been really dry lately. There is one requirement, and that is the color coding. And the color coding is really important so that we can read each other's work. So we use blue, yellow, pink, and green sticky notes. And in case you have color blindness, the one workaround that I've thought of, and if you have a better idea, I would love to hear it. But the workaround that I've thought of is just on your sticky note, just either label it the color or BYPG, or use ORCA to just like label what you mean that note to be. So we just really want to be able to read each other's work, and the color coding is a really quick way to do that. Okay, so I mentioned earlier, ORCA stands for Objects, Relationships, CTAs, and Attributes. And if we go through the ORCA process, we end up with a solid foundational structure for our product. We're designing the IA, and we're doing it before we design any screens. So before we design any screens, we ask ourselves a bunch of questions. So for the O, we're asking ourselves, what are the objects in the user's mental model or the business model? What are the things in our system? And I'm gonna take a little sidebar here. This is, I said system. I've been saying system a lot, and this is a place that I like to start with my own clients. I say, you know, the thing that we're building for you is a system. And then I go to merriam-webster.com and I pull up the definition. I say, this is the definition of a system. And so for us, in order to understand your thing and in order to design your thing right, we first need to understand what are the things, what are the items in your system? What are the things that people are coming here to interact with? And those are our objects. So then we move on to the R and we ask, what are the objects' relationships to each other? So that interconnectedness bit, system, the definition of a system is an interconnected group of items. So the relationships are the interconnectedness bit. So when we draw out that relationship between the things, that ends up being the meat of our contextual navigation. Or for today's purposes, our wayfinding. Then for the C, we ask ourselves, what calls to action do objects offer users? So our CTAs are the verbs, they're the actions. And I want to make clear that in OOUX, we're not downgrading the verbs. We cannot live without the verbs. They're very important. They get us, so they make us do the things we want to do. So we're not downgrading the verbs. We're simply elevating the nouns. We're designing our objects with the verbs attached, with the action attached, so that the object is directly manipulable. And then for the A, we ask ourselves, what are the attributes that make up the object? So in other words, what are all the extra bits and pieces of information that make up the object? So that's ORCA, objects, relationships, calls to action, and attributes. So now I'm going to dig in a little further. And what I'm about to go through, it's just a tip of the iceberg for what ORCA can do. Sophia has structured this as a 15-step process. Again, it's a very flexible 15 steps. You don't have to do all 15. You don't have to do it in any particular order. You can just pick and choose what makes sense for your project. And what I'm going to go through is maybe 5 or 6 of those steps. Okay, so we've established that the objects are things that have value to the user or business. And when we start to think about what the objects are in our system, we also want to think about what the specific instances are of that object. So the object itself is like an archetype. It's like a cookie cutter or a template or a stencil, and then the instance is the specific thing. So a cookie cutter makes a cookie. So if we have a website like IMDb, an object in that system is movie, and instances of movie are Black Panther, Jojo Rabbit. Another object in IMDb would be actor. And instances of actor are, Chadwick Boseman, Taika Waititi, ScarJo, we could go on. So how do we go about finding and deciding the objects in our system? I'm going to do a little demo project for you here. We're going to say that our client just opened up an independent pharmacy, or in the UK, I think you say chemist shop. So an independent chemist shop in the neighborhood, and they want an app for their customers. So we're going to go noun foraging. We're going to gather all of our user research. We're going to gather all of our desk research. We're going to gather all of our conversations with stakeholders, and we're going to take a blue highlighter and we're going to highlight all the nouns. So blue is for objects. As you do this more and more, you will naturally also want to highlight the verbs and the adjectives. But when you're just getting started, I would advise to just stick with the nouns at first. And then what do we do with all of these blue highlights? We put them on sticky notes and we throw them on our board. And then there's probably a lot more than you know what to do with. So we're going to consolidate. Anything that's outside of our problem domain, we don't need it. Anything that's outside of our scope, we don't need it. anything that's a synonym will consolidate down to the one word. Probably we want to use the word that the users have used the most, since that's matching their mental model. And so for us, for our chemist shop buddy down the street, we have decided we're going to concentrate on these three objects: patient, prescription, and condition. And those are the objects for our system. So then we move on to the R. How does each thing in our system connect to the other things? In our IMDb example, so the relationship between a movie and an actor is a movie has one-to-many actors. There's also a relationship, a reverse relationship between an actor and movie. An actor may have zero to many movies. An actor may only do like TV or video game voiceovers. So they are still an actor, but they just may have zero movies. That is a relationship. They may have 10 movies. So how do we think through the relationships? We have a matrix that we use to think through this. It's called our nested object matrix. And for our chemist shops, what we do, we have our three objects at the top on the x-axis, and we list our objects again on the side on the y-axis, and these are our nested objects. And what we do is we go cell by cell, and we ask, is there a relationship between these two things? And what is that relationship? So like I said earlier, this is a map of your contextual navigation. You're saying this object exists within the context of this other object within our system. So this is your inherent wayfinding using object-oriented thinking. Then we're going to move on to the C. So like I said earlier, we want to design our objects to be directly manipulable. I'm going to steal a line from Jorge Arango. He's an information architect. If you are not aware of him, you should look him up. He's great. So I think he says this in his book, Living in Information. He says something like, we want to design our digital spaces to feel as much as possible like our physical places. Thinking in objects and interacting directly with objects is how we live in the physical world, right? I play a game on my phone. I wash my hair. I type on my computer. We interact directly with objects in the real world. So, doesn't it make sense, intuitive sense, to also do this in a digital space? And we have another matrix that we use to think through this. It's our CTA matrix. So again, we have our objects up at the top. And this time on our y-axis, we have different user types. So not personas, but actually, what are the different types of users that are going to use our system? And again, we go cell by cell and we ask, what action does this user want to take on this object? And we write our CTAs or verbs on green sticky notes. So as an example, as a patient, I want to request a refill for a prescription. Or as a chemist, I want to dispense a prescription. So as you can hear, this matrix also gives us a list of user stories. And then for the A, we want to think through the attributes. So we have three types of additional information that can make up the object. We have core content. We put that on yellow notes. It's something like a description or a photo. It's usually content that a human is responsible for. We have metadata in pink. That's usually a piece of information that's sortable or filterable. And we've already talked about nested objects. These are also attributes of the main object. So in an object like movie, we have the movie name, we have the nested object actor, we have movie description and runtime. This is the structure of your object. But also I'm not showing CTAs here, but like for movie, we would have something like watch or download or rent or buy. Those are actions that you could possibly take on a movie. I'm not sure that IMDb does that, but you know, they could. And so we have things that we can do on that object. For actor, we're probably not going to have a CTA. Like on the admin side of the system, they might have something like update or edit information about this person. But for you and me, there's probably not an action that we can take on an actor. There's no CTA that's going to say, take Taika out for coffee. But if you do make that app, I would test it for you. So there's no action on actor, but look, we do have a nested object. So we don't have a dead end here. We have relevant information that somebody looking up Taika Waititi might be interested in seeing what movies he's been in or directed or produced, what TV shows, same thing. So so there's relevant information, there's contextual navigation, there's inherent wayfinding. So when we've done all of this work for our objects, we end up with an artifact called an object map. And this is our chemist shop example again. So we've got all of our objects at the top. We can prioritize them from left to right. We have all of our attributes going from top to bottom. And now that we have our object map, we have a structure for our system. We've designed the IA. And now what we can do, we can go object by object. We're ready to do some lo-fi sketching. So we can take the prescription object. And the first thing that we want to do is prioritize all of these attributes. So I've done that. So on the left is, as I was thinking about what makes up a prescription object, I just threw that up. And then on the right, I've thought about it from an information and content perspective. What is the most important piece of information about a prescription? And from top to bottom, I've organized that. And then I'm going to say, you know what, those last 5 attributes on prescription, I don't need those right now. Those can go in the backlog. We're just going to start with this much, these 7. And so now I can start to sketch. And if I wanted to draw out what a small card on mobile might look like, this would fit like 2 or 3 attributes. Maybe it looks like this. My priority sort of helps dictate which attributes I want to bring in. And then a larger card might look like this. And if you'll notice, the attributes from the smaller card and the attributes on the larger card stay in the same place. And that's because we want to design our objects so that they're recognizable wherever we are in the system. We want the user to stay oriented and grounded and be able to recognize the things that they're looking for. And if we made a list view of things, the information is still in the same priority. So it looks really similar to the cards. It's still recognizable. A user shouldn't be too confused about what they're looking at if they see a card for prescription, and then on the next page, they see a list for prescription. It should be pretty easily recognizable. So that is how I think object-oriented thinking inherently adds orientation and wayfinding to your information architectures. And how can you get started and learn about this right away? This is a list of resources. Please feel free to screen capture this. the one on the bottom, the launch guide, is the one that's going to most quickly get you up to speed. All of these obviously are on OOUX.com. There's a lot of good reading to be had there. So I just highlighted a couple places that you might get started. And thank you. If you wanted to get in touch with me, these are the ways. I'm trying not to be on Twitter too much anymore, but I am on these other places for sure. So that's it. That's me.
Super cool. Thanks so much, Upma. We have a question that says, let me just dig it up. How do you see ORCA as related to ontologies and content modeling? Does it replace or work alongside?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it very much works with. In my dream project, in my dream project team, I would be working as a UX person, and I would have a partner who is a content strategist, and we together would go through this process, and the content strategist would take insights that we learned from ORCA and do content strategy things. Actually, let me come back here. And yep, here. Okay, so a content strategist would take care of a lot of those yellow notes, the content that's being produced, the description that needs to be written, the photo upload that needs to happen. And how does that fit into the CMS? What kind of parameters do we have around that content? And then as a UX person, I would take those pink bits and figure out like how and where do those get displayed. And there's a lot of, when we get more advanced in ORCA, you can think about both sides of the sticky note. If you flip the sticky note over, there's a ton, there's like pages and pages and pages of information that go into what that sticky note actually means. So like, how does the data get rolled up? Do we need to collect this data in the relationships? Like how does it all work? What are the rules and logic of the system? So I think there's a lot of overlap that content and UX can work on together. And I think it's a really happy place to be. So absolutely, I think it works really well for both. And I also want to say that Sophia sort of birthed this process from thinking about content modeling. So she I don't know if she still does, but she at least used to call this content modeling on steroids. So she is very much coming from that place, but she's also very much coming from a user experience design place.
Cool. We just had a question come in. How can you apply things like OO and ORCA in agile environments?
That's the $1 million question, right? Everybody. So I will say I've not actually done anything like that quite yet. I'm sure it's coming. I also, personally think that design doesn't really fit into an agile world all that well. I don't like kind of fitting the circle in the square or the square in the circle. But this is the world that we live in. This is the way that we have to work. And so the basic idea, the starting point idea would be that the design team would have like a sprint 0 or maybe 2 sprints ahead of the development team, so that they can get a lot of this object mapping work done or started. And then well, actually, so when you have an object map that is done, what you can do is you can sort of, and it's prioritized left to right and it's prioritized top to bottom. What you can do is draw like a circle around the left-hand corner and say, all right, this is what we're going to do for our MVP. Everything else is in the backlog. So what you can do is once you get rolling on your sprints, you can say, okay, so for sprint 10, we're going to pick up the object actor and we'll do like 2 attributes for it. Or you could say, all right, for the next sprint, we've got like 5 attributes that we can enhance this object. So once you get rolling, I think once you have the object map and once you're like into it, you can structure it that way. And I think it's good to think ahead so the design team knows like what to get in stone so that the developers can work on it next. But in the beginning, I think getting it set up is a little like squishy.
No, really interesting. And maybe a final question from me. In terms of user research, because you earlier in your deck, you kind of said that kind of ORCA and OOUX kind of sits maybe or is best suited or most suited at the center of the double diamond. How do you kind of like involve user research and validation and kind of end users in kind of the process?
That's a great question. I love it. Actually, so the couple of projects, the few projects that I've worked on where I've used it at work. One was straight up, we just need to figure out the information architecture of this thing while we're doing all these other things. So I kind of did it on the side and brought it in as needed. But the next project I worked on, I was actually assigned to this project as a lead researcher. So I was like, you know, how am I going to incorporate the way that I think into doing the research part of this program? And so what I ended up doing was, in my pre-research, I did an object map for the product, or I did one the way that I thought it looked like, which was like half right. But I used that to shape my research and to ask users questions about how do you think about this product and what do these things mean to you? So I used a lot of my OOUX thinking in my pre-research and used it to shape some of my research, generative research. And then what I did with the generative research insights is basically, so I did the thing where I had the transcripts and I imported all the transcripts onto sticky notes onto my whiteboard tool and found affinity mapped patterns and all this. But then I also went ahead and did some object mapping or information modeling based on what the users had said. So I wanted to make sure that we understood what the users' mental models were and that we would follow that within our design. So I thought I actually really liked doing that process of the full sort of generative research process and incorporating, and that's really what we, when we go noun foraging, that's what we're doing. We're taking all of our research and we're highlighting all the nouns in blue, and we're taking those insights and starting our object map that way. And this was just like the same thing with a little bit of a different flavor.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And there's a question that's come in from, or 2 questions which actually just popped up in order. There's a question from Imogen Levy, and she asks, you mentioned that you often partner with a content strategist when doing OOUX projects. Are there any other key roles or capabilities when taking on an OOUX project? Is there like an OOUX dream team?
Yes, cross-functional. It works the best and the most fun when you have people from your design team, you have people from the content side, you have your stakeholders really well involved, you have developers looped in right at the front. The more, the more people that you have that are involved in the project, that are involved in this process, the stronger and better your system is going to be, because you're asking a lot of questions about how the system works and what the rules and logic and the functions are of the system. And if people on your cross-functional team don't know the answers, that's okay, because you're going to go back to do more research and find out what those answers are. But a lot of times people on your cross-functional team will have answers, or they'll have, I don't know what the exact answer is, but I know that here is a constraint that we need to consider. So the more information that you have from the more people that are involved in the project, you can keep that cross-functional team, kind of do like working sessions every so often, pretty regularly. I think that's the best way to go.
Interesting. Sounds like you expose risk and get engagement early. There's another question that's coming from Helen. She's asking, where do you see evaluative user research coming into this process? So if you're taking formative insights and bringing them into structure, well, how do you evaluate them?
Evaluative research can be done once you have an object map. And what you can do is, you can take some of those lo-fi wireframes, or you can do even more rudimentary. You can just do a paper prototype to sort of make sure that the navigability of the system is working in the way that you want. So basically, just kind of take a paper prototype of your object map and make sure that people can find the things that they're looking for. I've not been able to do that kind of usability testing on an object map yet, but I have heard anecdotal stories of that type of user testing going really, really well, because they put a lot of thought into what the structure of the system is and how things connect. And so when they put the most rudimentary paper prototype in front of a person and say, how would you find this thing? They're just able to do it right away. So I'm eager to be able to do that someday.
That's really cool. We're at the end now of We Are London. So thanks to Tom and John and Upma for preparing their talks, and everything's just moved to my Zoom. Putting the time in to prepare their talks and giving up their time to come here today, especially Upma, who's up super early in Philadelphia.